This is the first in a series of 3 videos looking at different elements of speed reading, and the first one is looking at reading text strategically. Now, when we're talking about speed reading, there are a couple of points to remember. The first is that being able to read fast or slow is not indicative of your academic ability. There are huge differences between different subject areas, and of course it's far more important that you really understand what you're reading than just getting the reading done. Opening a book and skimming through it won't necessarily move your understanding forward. There are always going to be texts that are tricky to read, but some of the skills that we'll be looking at in these videos will help you identify those texts so that you don't spend the same amount on a text whether you find it accessible or inaccessible. But we do just want to point out that everyone reads at different paces for different reasons depending on the material that they're working with. Now, first of all, it can be quite helpful before we really delve into some of the techniques in terms of strategic reading, just to think about what reading is. And it really isn't just opening a book and looking at the words on the paper. There are a number of stages. First of all, recognition. We have to actually understand the marks on the page. So is it written in a language that we understand? Is there vocabulary in there that we don't understand? Sometimes that's a huge barrier to us getting access to the text in the first place. Then we go through a number of stages, actually taking on board the material, and for some people it can be easier to listen to that rather than look at it. Then there's the understanding within the context in which it's written on the page. So as I said, sometimes the vocabulary can disrupt that level of comprehension, but could we answer a simple question about what was said on the page, even if we didn't really understand it more broadly? When we talk about understanding, we're not really talking about comprehension, we're talking about understanding something within the wider context of everything else that we know. Now, if this is a new topic, you may not understand it. You may need to read more to help you understand that text. However, if you're further through a particular part of your academic course, you may just be able to dip into a particular text and pull out a few elements just to deepen your understanding further. Of course, what we're working towards here is to be able to communicate what we've read. There's no point doing all the reading in the first place if we can't communicate it. So holding that information in our brains or taking really effective notes so we can retain information about what we've read, being able to recall it, so remembering who said things. Again, effective note making is really important here. It's not just about memorization, and then being able to put that into our own words. That's why we're reading in the first place. However, of course, there are a number of obstacles to reading. We find reading really difficult at different times. Now, as we've mentioned already, this might be because we just don't understand a particular area. So it's really difficult to open some books or some journal articles if we haven't got background understanding. As I mentioned before, maybe the language it's written in, working in translation. We might need to spend extra time sourcing a particular resource if we don't understand the language. It's easy to get distracted, so when our reading is broken, perhaps we're checking a phone or we've got other distractions around us, maybe family life or friends, or you're in a noisy cafe environment, it can be difficult to focus on material. Sometimes not really knowing why we're undertaking it, and we'll look at this in a moment because this is one of the key parts of reading strategically. Why are we doing this? You don't want to just be reading for the sake of it. It might be that the format that it's written in is inaccessible. So it might be, if you have a visual impairment, as we said, you may need an audio book or you may need it in an alternative format. It may be helpful to look at it with, particularly if you're reading online, to look at it through in a larger font or with a number of different screen filters on. And if you're just tired or not feeling well, it can be really difficult to focus on reading. So some of those you can do things about. Some of them you can't. And if you are having difficulty reading, do approach us in the library or the library's accessibility service, and we should be able to assist you. But one of the big things about reading strategically is knowing where you're going with your reading, as we said, not just opening a book and starting on page 1 and reading all the way through to the end of the book. Quite often we focus our reading, we target it. So there are a number of questions that it's really helpful to ask yourself. What are you trying to get out of this reading? And this ties very much into kind of critical reading and critical evaluation, which you may have looked at that video as well. Do we want to get general understanding out of this? Do we want something really specific? Do we literally want one citation? Do we just want to capture this person's main thesis in one line and that's all we need to get from it? We don't need to read the whole book possibly to get that out. Why is the author writing this? What's the context in which they're writing it? What was the audience like at the time? There may be particular biases in terms of what they're writing about. where's this research gone? If this piece of work was written 10, 20, 30 years ago, it might be really important to look at the context in which it was received and the work that's built upon this. Was it positive reception? Was it negative? Looking at how a piece of writing is organized. It might be really, really easy for you to dip into a piece of writing because it's really, really well structured. You know, a good author should signpost elements of their writing so you can strategically dip in, get the information you need and come out again. You don't need to read every single word. And why is this making a unique contribution? If it's not, possibly you don't need to read it. If you've already understood this somewhere else, if you've read summaries, as we said, if you've read more current work which references an older work, you may not need to read the original. So as I mentioned, this is really part of being kind of critical reading. It's not just looking at something and taking it at face value all the time when you're reading, thinking about, do you agree? Does this contribute to my particular argument? Is their argument robust? You know, does this devalue a little bit of what I was thinking about before? Do I need to change my thinking based upon this? What you shouldn't do is just read it, take it at face value, and then move on. Constant need to be engaging with it. And really at the end of it, you should be thinking about kind of, so what? What am I going to do with what I've read? Does it further my understanding? Does it reveal gaps in my understanding? Do I need to go and read something else instead? And at the very end, when you've finished reading, you should be able to say something to a friend or a family member about what you've just read. Not just to say, not to just to describe it, but to actually engage with it. Where am I going to take my research? So what I hope this presentation has revealed is that academic reading is really, really different to when we're reading a newspaper article or when we're reading a piece of fiction for pleasure. It's all about engagement. It's about dipping into a text. It's about looking for clues for arguments. It's looking at structure. It's about extracting what you need from that text. And what you get from that text will be totally different to somebody else because you'll have a different purpose behind reading it. Just because somebody's written 500 pages doesn't mean you have to read every single word. You need to think about how useful it is for your assignment. And in the next presentation, we'll be looking at how to actively read a piece of academic work.